Yeah, I'm happy we can save The Giving Tree for another time. It's still a great book. So, out of curiosity, has anyone here ever thought theologically about the offering? About, like, what we do when we collect the offering, about why it happens when it happens, why it's a part of worship, any of that kind of stuff? Anyone ever thought about that? It's not a rhetorical question. Like, seriously, has anyone ever thought about that? Did I hear a yes? So tell me why, if you want to. Do you want to share like some of your thoughts, Wendy? You just remember for some reason it was at the end of the worship. Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, it was kind of as it was like building to the offering. Okay. Well, anyone else have thoughts about it? Eb? It's a reflexive part of being a Christian. So when we do it in worship, it's just because it's part of who we are. Makes sense. Anyone else? Okay. Yeah, that all makes sense to me. You know, that's kind of what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to think theologically about what we do in worship. Even though I have been a Presbyterian my whole life, and I've probably been in church more Sundays than I have missed, I never really thought theologically about the offering. When I was a kid, the offering was like, it was just kind of like what Eb said. It was something that we do in worship, and it moved different places in worship. And if I recall, it moved when we got new ministers. The offering moved in worship. What I really remember as a kid is I remember my parents would give me a quarter and later $1 to put in the offering plate when it went by. That's pretty much what I remember. And then when I got a little older, but still really young, I remember getting to help take up the offering in church. I was probably, 10, maybe a little younger, right around in there. And I remember thinking that was really cool. I mean, every time I got to do stuff in worship, I thought that was really cool. I mean, obviously I was a bit of a nerd, but still, I thought that was really neat to be able to pass the plates around. But I never really thought about what we were doing in worship. It's just what we did. It's just part of the worship experience. And I kind of took it for granted that it's something that had always been there. But later, I found out, and this may surprise some of you, did you know that we've only been passing the plate, so to speak, for about 100, 150 years in mainstream Christianity? It's kind of a recent development when you think about the fact that we've sort of been in religion for like 2,000 years, that we've only been doing it for 150 years or so. It used to be that churches used to have out front the poor box. Does that name ring a bell? There would be a box for donations out the front of the church, and people would put their donations in that box, but all of those donations went to feed the hungry, to help the sick, to help the impoverished. None of those donations went to the maintenance or operations of the church. It wasn't until much later, when the church's other sources of revenue dried up, that we started taking up collections to help for the operations of the church. You see, for a long time, churches' money that would help them to function as a church, it came from places like they would have a pew tax. You would charge a pew tax to be able to sit in your pew. It's kind of like a rent for your family pew. They would get money from the local government. They would be engaged in business endeavors. Well, those sources started to dry up, and it was then that the churches realized we need to do something else to get money. And so we started passing the plate to take up collections of our offerings during service. And for me, that's what passing the plate has always been about. It's a collection of time, a time where money is collected in the plate for the operations of the church. And I always thought that until I had one experience in Kingston, Jamaica. I went to Kingston for a couple of weeks while I was in seminary. It was a class that I took down there. And during the week, I got to go with some friends, some students that I was down there with. We got to go and visit with a Catholic order called the Missionaries of the Poor. The Missionaries of the Poor did mission work in inner city Kingston to the impoverished who lived in the streets in Kingston. Now, if you've never been to inner city Kingston, anyone ever been to inner city Kingston, Jamaica? I didn't think so. If you've never been to inner city Kingston, the people that they describe as poor are very different from the people you would see described as poor here in our country. The folks who live on the street in Kingston, Jamaica are those who have no resources whatsoever. They are the folks who would normally be institutionalized in our country because of physical or mental impairments, but there are no government programs or social networks to take care of them in Kingston, Jamaica, and so they live on the streets. I mean, like, some of the things we had to do was we had to help people to shave because they were physically unable to shave. And I remember at one point as we were walking around, I got to walk into the kitchen. I always find my way into the kitchen wherever I go. And they were making lunch, and they were excited. It was a good lunch day. And they were making, it was either like chicken soup or chicken stew. And the main parts of the chicken that they were using for that stew or that soup were the feet and the heads. This was a good food day for them. Now, this is only to let you realize the level of impoverishment that this order and these people dealt with every day. So that weekend on Sunday, I met a family, like a host family, and they took me to church with them, and they were Baptists, so we went to the Baptist church. But the husband and the father in the family, he volunteered with the Missionaries of the Poor, and I remember him saying, let's go to a place where we can throw back our coats. It was a way of kind of like relax and worship. And it was because we went to worship with the Missionaries of the Poor. It was a little more relaxed style of worship, even though it was Catholic. And I remember at one point, the priest gave this really fascinating sermon. I remember it was really good. And at the end of it, though, as I was really excited about the sermon, I just heard it came time for the offering. It came time for a collection. And I got this knot in my stomach because I knew the people who were in that worship service had no money whatsoever. I knew that those plates were going to get passed and they were going to be empty. And I was anxious about that. Well, I was completely wrong. For starters, there were no plates that were passed. People came forward to the altar. And when they came forward to the altar with their offerings, they didn't just like walk drudgingly forward. They danced forward. They danced to the music that was being played, and they came joyfully down to the front of the church. Now, I was right when I realized I didn't have any money, because they didn't have any money, but they brought what they had. They brought sacks of food and groceries and toiletries and clothes. Whatever they had, they brought it as their offering. And from that moment on, it completely changed the way I think about offering, the way I think about the collection, the way I think about what we do when we pass the plates in church. For them, it was a joyous expression. For them, it was an expression of a generous spirit. For them, it was an expression of what they could give in return to God. And it to this day stays in my head as an example of what generous and generosity means. Now, to get back into the text, to get into 2 Corinthians, I noticed as going through the text, Paul uses two words kind of interchangeably. He uses grace and generosity sort of interchangeably in this text. And it got me wondering, are those words synonyms? Are grace and generosity the same thing? Now, the reason I started looking at it this way is that if you look in the text, we'll see that in the translation, in most English translations, and the one that Lester read this morning, the word grace only appears one time. Was anyone else counting how many times grace appeared in the scripture? Only appears one time. But in the Greek, in the original language that the New Testament was written in, the word for grace appears 5 times in that section of the text. It appears 5 times. It's just translated differently those other times. When first grace appears, it says the grace of God, and talking about the church in Macedonia. And then later on, the word privilege comes up. The church begged earnestly to share in the privilege of this ministry. Well, there the word privilege is the same word as grace. That's 2 of the 5. The last 3 are all translated as some form of generous or generosity. It talks about this generous act twice. And the generous undertaking, that comes up twice. And then generous act comes up after that. So these are all different ways of translating the word grace into generosity. So I started wondering if grace and generosity are the same thing. What is the generous undertaking or the gracious undertaking that Paul is writing about here in this text? Well, so this section of the letter is normally referred to as Paul's stewardship section. He is writing to gain support from the church at Corinth. Now, if any of you know much about missionaries, you know missionaries spend a great deal of time trying to earn support for their ministry. And when they try to gain support for their ministry, it's not like trying to get people to say, hey, good job working with the homeless. That's not what they're trying to do. When they try to earn support, they try to raise funds, try to raise resources to pay for the expenses of missionary work. Well, that's essentially what Paul is doing here. The only difference is he's not trying to raise money for himself. He's trying to raise money for the church in Jerusalem. In fact, one of the theories about why there's this tension between Paul and the church at Corinth, y'all remember us talking about this tension that was there, was that he would not accept money from the church for himself. If you remember, he worked as a tent maker while establishing the church. He didn't accept funds from them. And so one of the theories is that that's why there was this tension between them. It may or may not be true, but it kind of goes to this idea of what Paul is doing here. He's not raising money for himself. He's trying to raise money for another church. And in doing so, he lifts up the example of the churches in Macedonia. And the churches in Macedonia, he says, have been through an ordeal. They have been through an ordeal of affliction and poverty, and yet in their poverty, they begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry of giving generously. Remember, privilege here is grace, the generous ministry that he was engaged in. And so Paul is talking to the church at Corinth, trying to get them to go beyond their own walls and to give support, generous support to the church at Jerusalem. So Paul tends to look at grace and generosity as the same thing. The ministry of grace is a ministry of generosity, trying to get the churches to be involved in gracious giving or generous giving to other churches to support them. Now, giving to other churches to support, I wish that was something we did a little more of in the Presbyterian Church. We do it sort of. Each church in our denomination gives money to the presbytery, and then that money is distributed as resources for all the other churches. But I've always wished there was more of this direct assistance from larger churches to smaller churches, like evidently the wealthy church in Corinth and the smaller church in Jerusalem. But I digress. Sorry, where was I? Oh, yes. So, generous giving. So Paul is trying to encourage the Corinthian church to engage in this gracious or this generous act of giving of their means to the church at Jerusalem. When Paul talks about grace and generosity, he sort of expands on our understanding of grace. Because I think most of us, when we think about grace, we think about grace as a gift from God, right? Is that a pretty common understanding of grace? Grace is a free, unmerited, unearned gift from God to us. I had a pastor friend one time who was teaching a lesson on grace, and evidently he wasn't a very good teacher because he wasn't helping people to understand what he was talking about. And so he decided to go for an illustration. And so the next time the class met, everyone came in, and in front of each chair there was an individually, beautifully wrapped present for them. It was a surprise. None of them knew it was coming. None of them asked for it. None of them had done anything to earn it. And he said, this is an example of God's grace. God's gift to you, completely unearned, but for you. And that's a great illustration of grace. But I think Paul believes there's more to grace than just that. Remember, for Paul, it's never just about the individual. For Paul, it's also about the community and what the community can do. For Paul, grace is more than just that simple gift that we get from God. Grace is a way of living. Grace is a lifestyle. Grace is a generous lifestyle. A lifestyle of generous giving. That is what grace is to Paul. It's more than just the gift. Grace is an invitation for us as a community to be engaged in generosity, to be engaged in generous living, to be engaged in gracious living. When we think about grace and when we think about generosity and then it goes to generous living, we have to ask ourselves, how do we engage then in generous living? How do we live generously? Well, as Paul says, the way you live generously is to give of your means according to what you have. That's what Paul talks about. I mean, I'm very well aware that if there's another family that has the same resources as our family, but they have 6 kids instead of our 3 kids, they can't give as generously as we could, right? So Paul talks about give according to your means. And that's important, but can also be dangerous. I mean, how many times have we said, oh, I'd love to give to that, but I'm just not in the place where I can do that right now. Well, that begs the question then, how much money do we have to be in a place to be able to be generous? Paul recognizes this, and he says it is an issue of fair balance. Paul realizes that the resources in the world are not balanced or distributed fairly among the people of the world. It's still the same today. The resources of the world are not distributed fairly among the people of the world. Some have more, some have less. Our economic system is based upon that principle that some have more and some have less. But Paul says generous living is an issue of fair balance. And he quotes from the Old Testament when he says that those who have much do not have too much, and those who have little do not have too little. So how do we engage in generous living? We try to make sure that those who have much do not have too much, and that those who have little do not have too little. Generous living is the grace that God has given us. By God's grace, we can live generously. And that is the challenge that Paul puts before us. The grace that he is talking about, yes, it is a gift from God. But if all we do is take it as our own personal, selfish gift, we are not really appreciating the true grace that God has given. Grace is not meant for us to keep just to ourselves. Grace is meant for us to live in a generous way to all of God's children. Amen.